Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Emily Marsh from the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce, and I'm so excited to have these fantastic panelists here today sharing this information. Before we kick off, I just wanted to do a little housekeeping and give you some other info. So if you are a business owner or employee or however you may be affected by the crisis right now, I encourage you to look at the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce's webpage. We have a ton of resources available for you on many, many different topics. We also have recorded webinars on different topics. So we have one on the CARES Act, one about working remotely. There's some other really good resources. So if you go to our website, which is concordnhchamber.com, you'll see a link right there to our COVID-19 webpage, and that'll direct you to more resources. So please check that out. Today, you'll notice that there is a Q&A option. So at the bottom of your screen, when you can open up your options there, you'll see that little Q&A button. So you can push that and then simply just type in a question, and our panelists will be able to read them and answer them. We may not be able to get to all questions today, but please submit questions through that Q&A portal. That is how we get your questions today. So then without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists. Thank you so much, Rob and Schell, for coming today. Your organization is a great resource right now. So if you have further questions, I recommend looking into Jackson, and Wagner. And please also, I'd like to welcome Jayme Simões from Lewis Karno and Company Communications LLC. Wanted to get the full name in there. Jayme is a great supporter of the Chamber. He's actually on our board of directors, also co-chairs our Creative Concord Committee, and is also the force behind the Visit Concord NH website, blog, social media, all of that. So he is really in tune to marketing right here in Concord. So is another really excellent resource to you that I like. Please utilize him after this webinar if you have further questions. If you have more questions after this, I will be emailing the recorded webinar to everyone who signed up to register, and we'll have more information for you there. So let's get started. Thank you so much, Robin and Jayme, for joining us today.
Thank you, Emily. And as Emily said, I'm Robin Schell with Jackson, and Wagner. And I want to thank you for inviting Jayme and I to do this presentation to you today on communicating with clients and customers and other constituents in a crisis. Certainly it's a timely topic given that we are all living through COVID-19 right now. And so for that reason, we're going to focus some of our comments on COVID-19, but a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is applicable across the board when we're thinking about preparing for crisis situations. So today I'm going to start out, and I thought I'd bring you back a little bit to thinking about the mindset of the folks that you're interacting with right now, your customers, your employees, perhaps other extended members of your family. So that we can do some thinking about that, because it impacts how we reach out to them and how we message to them. We'll also talk a little bit about an environmental scan and the importance of doing that, about thinking about who are your priority stakeholder audiences that you want to be proactively communicating with, and what kinds of behaviors you're looking for from them. Then I'm going to run through a few basic crisis communication principles. They should sound pretty familiar to most of you if you've been through a crisis, but I'll recap those. And then I want to talk about messaging, because it is important to think about what are the messages that are going to resonate with your key stakeholders during this time, and how are you delivering those messages? Do you know that you're delivering those through the effective channels? And I'll give you a couple of examples of organizations we've taken note of and how they've been able to navigate around the barriers of social distance during COVID-19 and create some opportunities. Then I'm going to turn it over to Jayme, who's going to talk with you about what some of the elements of your crisis communication plan should be, and some next steps that you might be considering as you plan and flesh out your crisis plans and think about how do we do a good job anticipating other issues, how do we do a good job getting our key spokespeople trained, and how do we build on the lessons that we've learned already from the crises we've lived through. So to really begin, I want to bring us back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And many of you will be familiar with this from your studies in school. But if you look at the pyramid, right now, most people are in those two bottom tiers, thinking about their physiological needs, food and water and shelter, etc. And also a big one right now is their safety needs. Pretty much 24/7, we're getting hit with these COVID-19 safety messages. So that's where people are focused. And if your message is going to be outside of that, chances are people aren't going to be paying a lot of attention to it. So you're going to really need to work on how do we pivot to make it relevant to what people are thinking about right now. Interestingly, the next tier up, when you look at social needs, I think this is an interesting one because people are really thinking about this now that it's been somewhat taken away from us. We're thinking about how do we connect with people creatively. For example, my church here in Amesbury has a daily Zoom lunch that they have created for people that are isolated and want to connect with other people. The top two tiers, ego needs, respect and status. How do we earn respect and status from other people? Things like that are just on the back burner. I sit on a panel for my professional association to select an award winner for mentoring, and that's about the last thing on everybody's list right now. It's just not important. And certainly self-actualization. How do we get satisfaction from the things that we're passionate about? I don't think a lot of people are focused on that, but certainly they might be spending some more time thinking about that while they're in isolation, thinking about how they're going to spend their time going forward. But just a little bit about people's mindsets and why it might be difficult to capture their attention on something that is in what I call the nice to have category. They're much more focused on need to have. Typically, when we work with clients, we talk about you've got to know what's going on around you. You've got to have a good environmental scan going. What's happening in the outside world that can impact you and what's happening inside your organization. And so in this particular situation, I think it's important to acknowledge what has the impact been on of this particular crisis on your employees, on your customers, on all of those key stakeholders. And do an environmental scan. What are some of your competitors doing? And how do your treatment of customers and clients match up with that? For example, the airlines seem to be unified in giving those that had made travel plans during this time and they need to reschedule those. They're trying to line up with their policies and be consistent in terms of what they'll give you for cash refunds or credit and that kind of thing. Typically, we say in a situation like this, particularly where there's a lot of fear involved, and certainly fear of not only COVID-19, but what's our economic situation going to look like a few months out from now. Over communication is better than no communication. So if you're trying to figure out how much do we communicate, Jayme and I would both agree that it's over communication is best at this time. And then take a look at how you might create some opportunities to collaborate with competitors, with your partners, your vendors, on how do we solve some problems? How do we deliver our products and services during this time, given the barriers that we've been dealt? So these are all things that we believe are part of your environmental scan and should be thought about in any crisis situation, really, but particularly now. At JJ&W, we're very big believers on not only identifying who your key stakeholders are, but also what are the behaviors that you want from them? What do you want them to do or not do or let you do on behalf of your organization? So we would encourage you to think that through, and rule of thumb, you're going to hear this a lot from us, that your internal audience needs to be first. they want to hear from you before they read it somewhere or hear it on the news. This includes not only your frontline employees and your management, maybe your board of directors, folks like that, your volunteers and your alumni, but even people who are in an arm's length from you, opinion leaders that are important to your organization, or vendors that you work quite closely with. So we've put a few ideas on who might be your priority audiences or stakeholder audiences on this slide. Customers, donors and investors, regulators certainly that can set some guidelines for how you're going to operate, your legislative representatives, your community members, your competitors, as I said, partners, vendors, and the media is on here as well. And certainly they are coming in handy right now for raising awareness to an issue and certainly reinforcing some of the messages. But we're going to suggest that it's important for you to go directly to your key stakeholders with those messages and be clear about the behaviors that you want from them. So something for all of you to be thinking about. When I talk about crisis communication in general, these are some of the general rules of thumb that we feel strongly that you should decide in advance who's running the crisis and who's running the organization, because sometimes a crisis can sap a heck of a lot of energy. So we want to have somebody who's really focused on that. And certainly Jayme and I have worked together on a number of crisis situations where we've been part of the team that's meeting on a daily basis, whether it be by phone or however you're going to set it up. But you do need some kind of system for bringing that crisis team together for regular communication. One of the things we always talk about too is don't forget who is the point of contact with the public. They're going to do a couple of things for you. They're going to be your eyes and ears, and they're going to be your screeners, because those are the folks that are going to take the calls from the media, and they're going to take the calls from customers and clients. We worked together on a school closure issue, and we made sure that the folks, the receptionists, were well armed with the basic Q&A, and here's what you do if the media calls, here's what you do if a regulator calls, etc. Also a reminder, and Jayme's going to talk about this a little bit more, so I'm not going to get into it except to say that you all should have some kind of spokesperson policy and some kind of media policy so that people know when they get a media call, who are we going to refer that to in the organization? And we typically recommend that it gets sent to a central point, whether that be your communication person or someone on your management team. And as far as media, just making it clear to them what your policies are. Again, we do a lot of work in the school space, so making it for media being able to be on campus and that kind of thing. Very important in any crisis situation that you stick to the facts, you don't speculate, you don't get led down that path. And that's why we recommend having a holding statement ready that's been blessed by everybody that it needs to be blessed by in your organization. That's going to vary organization to organization. And this is a placeholder. You'll be able to put this out until you get further information and you've been able to do some investigation and find out more about whatever the crisis situation is. As I said before, very important to make sure the internal audiences hear it first and be very transparent and consistent with your message. One of the phrases we use at JJNW, everyone should be speaking with one clear voice. And this does get trickier when you have other organizations who are involved. For example, if it's some kind of accident that involves, if you have some kind of transportation associated with your business and there's been an accident, you may have the police or whoever the trucking company that you're working with. Those might be part of the communication equation, and you need to be on the same page with them. Couple of other things to think about when you're thinking about your spokesperson and how they're delivering messages. Very important to show empathy to, and I think you are seeing that in some of the messages that have been delivered through the media and spokespeople on TV during this COVID-19 crisis. Sticking to key messages. Sometimes this is difficult when you're being interviewed by media who want to go in a different direction. if you want any kind of folks to study out there that do a real good job with this, just study the politicians, because no matter what question they ask, they are asked, they will always circle back to their key messages. So you'll be left saying, what was the question in the first place, you know? One of the tools we use for talking our clients off of a negative front page story ledge is we tell them to take the front page test. And basically that means that if your organization was featured in a negative news story that appeared on the front page, can guarantee that you read every word and that everyone in your organization read every word of that. And so, you know, they're freaking out thinking that this is a major blow to them. We like to back up and say, what else was on the front page that day that you remember? And chances are probably not a lot, because most of the other news you just scanned. And you need to kind of put yourself in that mindset and realize that just because something was very negative one time on the front page, it doesn't mean that everybody read every word and everybody reacted to every word. We're pretty good about saying, okay, so as a result of that, how many calls did you get from employees or clients or whatever? That's a behavioral measure. Did you get 2 calls or did you get 500 calls before you start thinking that this is a bigger deal than it actually is? We talk a lot about the need to be strategic when we're doing some crisis communication plan. One of my favorite little phrases is, you don't need a fire hose to put out a candle, right? So I like to go back to the example about 10 years ago. And I teach a PR boot camp for PRSA. And so I've used the Domino's pizza case study before, and at that time, they had some employees who put some video out in the social media space that showed them doing disgusting things to the pizza. The Domino's people reacted, they shut that down, they did all that. But then as they were thinking about how do we respond to this, instead of responding to it in the broad media, they responded to it in the social media space, right? So they didn't make a bigger deal out of it by overblowing it with everybody. And it's interesting, and granted, a number of years have gone by now, but hardly anybody really remembers that whole thing. And then we talk a lot about ripping the Band-Aid off, getting all the bad information out at once in a crisis. You're not always able to do that. And certainly crises that drag on and on. I mean, this current one is a great example, because every day you turn on the news and there's been a new discovery of some sort, or there's been an upgrading of the number of deaths, all of those kinds of things. So this isn't a good example of being able to rip the Band-Aid off. But again, going back to some of our school situations, when there's been an inappropriate teacher-student relationship that's been identified, typically the school will go out and they will ask for anybody else that's had this experience, because they want to get all that bad news and find it all out at once and deal with it all at once, rather than have it drag on for a long period of time. So some things to think about when you are conducting your crisis communication plan. I want to talk for a minute about messaging, because one thing we do know is that people will pay attention to messages that impact them directly, and they want to be able to know what to do. So you need to be very clear with them on, this is what the situation is, this is how it impacts you, this is what we'd like you to do as a result. And I go back to a fellow in our profession named James Grunig, who was a professor at the University of Maryland, came up with this model for effective messaging. So I'm sharing this with you with the COVID-19 example in mind. That first you need to identify the problem. COVID-19 is a highly contagious disease. That's the problem. Then you need to personify that for somebody. You can both get it and give it to others without showing symptoms. So this is something that impacts all of us. And then the constraint removal. What can we do about this? How can we protect ourselves? And we've been given a number of examples of this, between social distancing, using hand sanitizers, washing your hands for 20 minutes, staying at home unless it's an essential errand or you're an essential business and you need to get to the office. So As you're thinking about the messages you're putting together in a crisis situation, think specifically, how are they going to impact those key stakeholders, and communicate the behavior that you want to get from them. Back to the empathy piece, we talk a little bit about how do we humanize our message, and I think we've seen this with plenty of examples during this COVID-19 crisis. People empathizing with their stakeholders. We realize this is a difficult time. Reinforcing values of the organization. We're doing this because we care deeply about the health and well-being of our employees or our customers. Being very upfront and truthful, saying without this step, we're going to put others and our entire business at risk for the long term, and that's why we've decided to temporarily close. We're also big believers that you don't want to mislead people. Nobody really knows. Here in Massachusetts, Charlie Baker has put out May 4th. He wants us on a stay-at-home advisory through May 4th, but we all know that could change depending on how big or small these, the flattening of the curve and how effective it is. So, you know, being perfectly honest, we don't know how long we'll be following this protocol, but we'll definitely be evaluating it every couple of weeks, and we'll keep you informed. And then last but not least, giving people an opportunity to keep the conversation going. We want them to have a phone number so they can call people and get more information. Knowing the right channels, and Emily at the beginning of this call talked about going to the website, and that certainly seems to be a place that all of you as chamber members get information, and it's clearly labeled on there where to get your COVID-19 information. The Department of Health and Human Services has done a similar thing, and they've even put out a phone number to say if you have questions about an upcoming appointment, we have people on the customer services desk that are going to be able to help you out. So knowing in advance what those channels are where you're going to reach those priority stakeholders, that's a piece of research that I would encourage you to do before the crisis time, because you don't have time to do it when the crisis hits. I want to end my piece with giving a couple of examples of how people have creatively pivoted and navigated some of the barriers that have been created for them. And I looked at NPR and I realized, hey, this is kind of cool. They're doing a tips for homeschooling during coronavirus. That's a real service, because we know that there's a lot of folks who don't normally work at home who are now working at home, trying to balance that with also homeschooling their children. So that was a great timely topic and opportunity. I noticed, I'm an alum at UNH, I noticed UNH had a similar webinar last week that they gave. And then it's, you know, creating some opportunities. So the poor restaurant industry is taking it on the chin. There's no doubt about that. And they've needed to close, but some of them have been able to open and offer takeout delivery. And they've said, you know, hey, can you do something for us? Because we're losing all this money trying to sell alcohol and, you know, in our establishments. And so, you know, in New Hampshire, they have allowed restaurants to be able to sell some beer and wine when they are ordering pickup and delivery. And we ordered takeout last night, and I noticed on the phone call that the person who took the phone call did a great sales job. They asked us if we would like any beer, wine, or sangria with our order. And they asked us if we wanted to put a tip on there for the staff. So being very creative about the ways that we sustain our business, it's an important thing. And I'm going to end with this example. I belong to a gym. Everybody in my family belongs to a gym, and my husband happens to belong to the CrossFit gym. And they very kindly lent us some equipment during this time that CrossFit was closed. And we've made a little home gym in our home, and we've been able to do that. And he's continued to pay his dues and so forth and so on. I'm a member of Boston Sports Club, and you may have seen on the news that they're actually getting skewered right now because they did no communication to anybody. They thought it would be a good idea to just kind of stick their heads in the sand and keep charging their members, which worked until it didn't work, because a lot of members started to push back on that, and they got a lot of angry phone calls. They've now got the Massachusetts Attorney General on their case. I recently wrote a blog on it. If you go to the JJNW website, you can learn some public relations lessons that I communicated about this. But so some gyms embracing the opportunities, others creating a PR nightmare for themselves during this time. So I want to end here because I want to leave time for Jayme to do his thing, but I'll be happy to take any questions at the end, and look forward to our conversation then. So Jayme?
Thank you, Robin. And again, it is always a pleasure to work with you. You are such an amazing professional and so knowledgeable. So thanks for sharing this call with me. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Yeah, these are terrible times. And when the world is in a crisis, it is an unprecedented thing. I'm guessing no one on the call has seen this in their lifetime, obviously. So we're kind of making things up as we go along. But the good news is, at least in communications, there are theories, there are ideas, there are ways to manage a crisis that apply, because a crisis this big is never as much a one-level crisis. It goes on. First, it starts as a public health crisis, and then it goes on to be an economic crisis. And what comes next? What's the next shoe to drop? So I think as we look at what's going to happen to us as we go forward in the frame of, we've got a global pandemic crisis. So the first thing you've got to say to yourself is, who's on our crisis management team? Now, if you're a one-person organization, that's you. But it doesn't always have to be you. You heard from Emily earlier, if you're a member of the chamber, that a lot of very smart, very good folks there who can help you. If you're in the city of Concord, there's a terrific team of folks in the city who are there to help you. So you don't have to feel alone. You can reach out to colleagues, but if you're a bigger organization, you really want to think who needs to be at the table, who is going to bring resources and assets to get this thing done. So come up with your crisis management team. It could be 1, it could be 5, it could be 20, but it's important to define that team in advance and have them work together in advance. So that team needs to be able to communicate. Now, I know every day kind of seems like Sunday these days, but it's important to have their email addresses, their phone numbers, the way that you can reach out to people available to everybody in a way that is accessible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's exceptionally important. And then you add to that list your outside counsel. Who's your lawyer? What law firm do you work with? Is there a regulator involved? Is there someone at the city or at the state who you need to communicate with? That's really important, because at the time of a crisis, it's not uncommon for somebody to call a trade association, the city, a state organization, and ask them about what's going on in your organization. And if they're not on the same page and you haven't reached out to them and you don't have a bridge of communications going, what they say may not be what you want to hear. So it's very important to have all that stuff down. And of course, that has to include, the local police department, as well as opinion leaders, the mayor, for example. Think about all the folks you have on your internal crisis management team and all the folks in your community that you're going to need to work with should something go wrong. Again, in the framework that something already has gone wrong. Now, what types of stress points will it reveal? Look at a crisis as a crucible. Really, it is a hot flashpoint. And a lot of organizations, I'm going to be honest, are not going to survive this. It's the stronger organizations, the ones that are well managed and have a plan, that will get through this and hopefully emerge with a stronger brand and a stronger vision. So you've put that in, and again, don't forget, if you have a PR counsel, to bring him or her or that firm in. That's very important. It's always good to have a third party. And as I said earlier, your lawyer, if there are going to be legal issues, it's very important to work with your attorney. So the more you can do in advance, the easier it will be when things go wrong. Robin talked about holding statements, for example. That is something that you would write that would address a specific issue. We'll talk more about those issues in just a minute, but if you have things already written, if you have things already planned, if you have kind of a well of preconceived ideas and written statements that you can go to, when things go wrong, they happen very quickly. And the quicker you can react, the better it's going to go for you. We talked about the Band-Aid. It could be a one-day event. The last thing you want to do is have it be a 6 or 7 or 8 week event. It's important to get out as much information as quickly as you can to address issues and questions as quickly as they come up, because where there is no information, conjecture will come in. And you don't want the media or opinion leaders or community folks speculating about what's going on. Nobody wins from that because often half-truths come out in the place of real truths. We had an issue with a client some years ago, a transportation company. They lost a passenger, and we worked with them to get answers to the media right away, because I found as I was talking to the media as a third party representing them that there was a lot of conjecture going on. Oh, this happened because they didn't know the facts. They were making it up as they're going forward, not because they thought, oh, this must be the reason, this must be the rationale. So have that game plan ready and realize that right now, you've got a game plan where you may have to be working from your homes. You maybe have to be working in a way that isn't usual. You're not there in the store or the restaurant or the hotel or the office or the theater. So how's that going to work? How are people going to communicate? How are you going to keep that information safe and secure until it's time to go forward? Be thinking about how that works for you. Again, the more preparation you do in advance, the better you're going to respond. And then there's, okay, we're going into this now. What are our front lines of communication? Do you have a media policy? Robin had referenced that earlier. That wasn't my fault. And the question was, what happens when somebody calls? What happens when somebody texts? What happens when somebody emails or writes to one of your social media pages? Who's going to respond to that? Should they respond to it? How are they going to handle it? Have a media policy set up. It's kind of setting up a barricade around you in every possible way so that those gatekeepers can keep track of the information as it comes in. And they themselves know not to speculate, not to engage in information or questions or off the record. They simply take down the name of the person, where they're calling from, what their deadline is, and who they want to talk to. And then that goes up to the crisis management team and to your spokesperson, who you have prepared, who has practiced, who has those key talking points that Robin spoke of earlier. And she was referencing that in the ways the politicians do it. If you hear a politician be interviewed, he or she, if they're good, will always stay in the talking points that they're comfortable with, because they know that the further they get away from their talking points, the more they're opening doors to new questions. So you really have to prepare your spokesperson well so that he or she is ready. This is also important as you think about it, because our next point on the PowerPoint is the templates and statements. You have to make a decision. Do we want to go with a written statement, or do we want to go with a spokesperson? And there are benefits and there's dangers either way. If the situation is relatively simple, you're going to want to go with the written statement if everything is out there. Because the great thing about the written statement, there's not going to be a follow-up question directly, and so you're not going to open new doors. But if it's complex and there's a lot of questions that have to be answered, that's when you're going to need a spokesperson, somebody who can go out there, who can answer all the questions and put everything to rest. So you have to wait. It's good to have a written statement. That information should be consistent with what you have on your website, what you're doing with social media. But in some cases, somebody's going to have to go out there and answer the tough questions and do a good job doing it. So that person needs to be ready. So talking about holding statements, what are they? We've thrown this around. I'll admit that this is jargon for us who work in the industry. A holding statement is basically like a press release, which is also a form of jargon, but basically it's laying it out, a communication from your organization to the media, through the media, to your key audiences, explaining what happened in the voice of your organization. And Robin talked about how to kind of frame that in terms of showing empathy, recognition of what's happening. And this is very important in a crisis leadership. You really have to, if you did something wrong, you've got to own up to it and say you're sorry and explain where you're going. Also show cooperation with any type of investigation or local officials. All this stuff is really, really important. So we've listed down on the screen for you some different types of issues and questions that you could, and hopefully none of these affecting your industry or your business, but let's take a look at them just quickly. So we've got an illness around. There could be an accident, there could be a death, somebody on your team could fall ill. How are you going to respond to that? How's that going to work? Especially if you're doing something where you're in service, you're dealing with the public, or you're a grocery store. How is that going to, what are you going to say? And how are you going to frame that? What if you have to close or you've been shut down by the state or by the federal government? People are going to worry about you, especially if you're a publicly traded company. How are you going to handle that? Or you're a single shop that people depend on. Do you have a transition going? so that you can frame the issue in a positive way, from the negative of being closed to the positive, like we're still doing business online. Lawsuits, they can and will happen. The courts are kind of shut down right now, but something will come out of it eventually. How are you going to respond to that? How are you going to answer questions in a way that won't hurt your ability to defend yourself? Layoffs. The numbers are not good this morning across America. A lot of people are losing their jobs. Obviously, there's a lot of understanding as to why that happens, but you've seen companies where there have been layoffs and the top management is still there and making really good salaries, struggle to answer those questions. So there will be a great deal of scrutiny as companies lay off employees and how they handle their employees and how they treat them, especially as many of those employees lose their health insurance. We're looking at bankruptcy for many organizations and potentially financial mismanagement, because all of a sudden, when the cash disappears, financial issues start to become very apparent that weren't as apparent a few weeks ago. How would you frame that? How would you deal with that in a statement? Obviously, we're in a public health emergency, but does it impact or reflect on you in a specific way that is unique? You have to be prepared to answer questions about. What if not a competing organization, excuse me, another nonprofit, a similar store, restaurant, what if they start to have problems? It's not uncommon for the media to come ask you about that. And in most cases, you want to be supportive, right? You don't want to wish anything ill on somebody else that could come back to you. That's not good citizenship. But how are you going to respond to that? Are you going to do it in writing? What kind of statement would you write there? Economic downturn. There's the other shoe. And I'm guessing that there's probably 5 or 6 shoes here. But there's the other shoe. How are you going to explain to investors or to regulators how you get through this? How do you explain your cash flow and your business model? This is a crisis that could very easily happen. And there's so many others that could come out in this. I mean, unfortunately, there's hardly an industry that hasn't been impacted by COVID-19 and the financial crisis. And as I said, it's a crucible. So the stress that it puts on an organization is tremendous. We'll take a second to go through these next steps, and then I see we've got a couple questions that we could address. But first, next steps. And we're not going to address these today, but these are things for you to be thinking about as we move forward with this discussion. One is issue anticipation and scenario planning. I think we just did a little bit of that, but you have to say what's coming down the pipe. What is the 12th shoe that's going to drop? What do we have to be worrying about? And that really goes well with social media monitoring, because almost all of us now have some sort of social media presence. And it is so crucial to understand what is normal on a day in social media in the current context, and where can we kind of put buoy markers to see that there's a tide rising of new questions, of new issues. And this is not a normal day, that there's a new crisis slowly manifesting itself. It's odd that you will now see that on social media well before you see it in a newspaper or on Channel 9. And so let social media kind of be your warning light, your canary in a coal mine, if you will. Have an understanding of what a usual day is for you on social media, and set points of things that you want to look at as well. So moving on to media training for key spokespersons. We talked about having the spokespersons ready, or spokesperson ready should a crisis happen. It is very, very, very important in this context to get them ready now, and to train them, and to do kind of an FAQ, and to quiz them, maybe get them on tape so that they can understand what's going on. This is a good investment. And finally, lessons learned. When all this is over, when the dust settles, and we will survive this because it's a bump on the road and there are many, but the road goes on. How do we handle it? How did our crisis management team do? How do we do with issues? How do we do with responding to the media? How do we do on social media? Do we have a social media policy? What worked? What didn't? And what can we do better next time? It's not easy to do that. After you've gone through the spin cycle a couple times, it feels like the world is against you and you just want to walk away and move on. But don't do that until you've taken the opportunity to learn, to analyze, to grow and be stronger. Yeah, it's not easy, but it's really, really important because every crisis is a little bit different. But if you see what worked, you'll learn those lessons. And the next time, I think you'll find it will be significantly easier. Hopefully there won't be a next time. On that note, we've built this as an interactive seminar. Robin is here. I see we have a couple questions from Lynn and Byron. If you have questions, please type them in. We're happy to answer them for you. I know that it's impossible in 40 minutes or 45 minutes to address every potential concern. and crisis point. But we would be very, very happy to discuss them right now. And then, by the way, and Robin, is there anything you wanted to add before we go to the questions?
I think the only thing that we didn't really talk about, but probably should be thought about, is access to your crisis plan. And some of the organizations that we've worked with have an app so that they can access the crisis plan on an app in the situation where there's been some physical damage to the building and people aren't allowed in the building. Certainly right now is a great example of not being able to be allowed in the building. So thinking through for all those kinds of scenarios. And just in terms of issue anticipation, the importance of doing that environmental scan of, what's happening out there and could it impact us in any way here, and really staying on top of that, because you never know when an issue that's been on the back burner, what we call a latent issue, can find its way to the hot issue pretty quickly. And then, as Jayme was pointing out, what are the fallout issues? What are the potential things that could happen as a result of this hot issue? So those are all important things, and all things we can really think through in advance. Even though we don't have the crystal ball, we can't think of every scenario, but we can do a good job anticipating some things that might impact our organization. So that's all I would add. Great job, Jayme.
Well, listen, hey, as they say, if you're going to take a bath, at least come clean. If a lot of stuff's going to come out, whatever it is, get it all out at once, put it all out there, deal with it, and the world will go on and the sun will rise another day. Rob and I worked with a healthcare organization a few years ago. They had an issue around vaccinations. They were very conscientious. They prepared. They put the story out there in a very responsible way. They had a social media plan for the story. It was a 24-hour story. They took their lumps, but they were in a leadership role and they showed what their plan was and where they were going. And I think that after it was all done, of 800 and some people who needed to come back for follow-ups, only a couple were unhappy with the organization. So being open-handed, showing empathy, having a plan is really the best way to get through something where possible. And I think at this point, there's a lot of sympathy out there because we're all kind of in the same boat right now, aren't we? So hopefully we're feeling more like a community than we are individuals.
One PS on that vaccination story, one of the things we did was we trained the people who were going to be working in the healthcare setting, that were going to be taking the appointments from people, because we knew that they were going to get some parents that were furious that, oh my gosh, I have to bring my 5-year-old back and do the vaccine all over again. And it's how you handle a situation. It's the temperament in which you handle the situation, and that you're ready for some of the tough questions that can make all the difference in terms of those people who are on the front lines and they are representing your organization. So I see that we have a question here. What is appropriate use of humor, if at all, in social media at this time without making light of a serious situation? We find that lightweight posts are being well received by our followers and creating engagement. And how do you do it smartly without changing your company's voice? Great question. I'm willing to start, and Jayme, could you jump in perhaps and just say that, something like that, this is a real judgment call. And I think there's a difference between perhaps, making a joke about the amount of toilet paper that's flying off the shelves in a grocery store to something that really does dig at the impact on perhaps your frontline employees and something like that might be more sensitive in nature. So I think it's a real judgment call, but certainly with your internal audience, if you're finding that, little bits of humor get them through the day. I think it's interesting now that we have all this social distancing and so forth. Friends of mine will start the day and they'll send me a little text that is, one of those little songs where they've done a parody and they've interjected something about COVID-19 or something to make us laugh during this time that's so serious, that's so heavy with people that are losing their lives. So I think it's a matter of determining where you're using the humor, and if it's something that's lighthearted or is it something that really hits on a sensitive topic and is not going to be a good idea. So Jayme, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree. I think that, when you're on social media, the last thing you want to do is offend anyone, and you have to be very careful. People are losing loved ones. People are struggling for their lives. A little bit of humor can be appropriate if done in a tasteful way, but one has to be careful to be respectful and show empathy of the challenges that people who have lost their jobs, who have lost their business are facing. I would approach social media with the scientific parable of the three bears. I think, if you look at people on social media, they're easily fall into 1 to 3 categories. There's the one whose porridge is too cold. These are the organizations who are acting like nothing has changed. They've got their social media posts programmed in from a month ago, and they're running, and there's no message of what's going on right now. And then there's the porridge that's too hot. These are the people who really can't stay in their own lane, who are maybe oversharing, who maybe think that they're the CDC. I think there's also folks who may be acting like lemmings because they saw somebody else say, oh, here's to all these folks who are doing this. I'm going to say the exact same thing, and everybody's saying it. And then it seems a little trite and insincere. So you don't want to be in either camp. You want to have the one whose porridge is just right, maybe fewer posts, maybe posts that show empathy with customers or with staff. Posts that are inspirational. I think it's not unfair to share a video from a couple of years ago right now and say, I hope we can get back to that. That would be my advice. Stay in your lane, maybe do less, let's be more, and show a little empathy and sincerity, as Robin had alluded to earlier.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions at this time.
There was a question from Emily, I think. Yes.
Yeah, so I have a few questions here, and I also just wanted to jump on again to say, if you have a question, please use our Q&A feature. So you'll see that if you tap your screen on your smartphone or move your mouse a little bit, click on the button that says Q&A, and that's where you can type in an answer that we can all see. So please go ahead and use that feature if you're not familiar with it. So I have a question here specifically about a potential problem that could be facing businesses. You mentioned this briefly. What would you do if one of your employees is diagnosed with COVID? For example, if you are a restaurant owner or you're running a grocery store, that to me seems like it could be a real disaster. So do you have advice for dealing with something that could really potentially completely break your business right now?
Well, I think, a lot of what we've talked about applies to the situation, right? So you're going to take action of some sort, right? You're going to, you've identified it. The employee has been quarantined. Anybody who's showing symptoms are going to be lining up to get tests. You see this in grocery stores. Actually, there was a situation that was on the news where somebody went in and they weren't necessarily even COVID-19, but they, for some reason, they were touching and spitting and doing some things. I think it was Stop and Shop that faced this. And so what they did to address the problem, shut down, sanitized everything. And, I think organizations are going to want to know, is it safe for me to go back in there shopping after something like that? I don't think that people are going to be shocked if someone at a grocery store gets this thing is everywhere. So they're not going to, think it's the store's fault or anything like that, but they are going to say, okay, as a result of that, what have you done? And and I've seen it in my own grocery store, they went from, having a piece of tape where you have to, stand behind the tape until the next person has gone in front of you to, we now have people clicking so that they only want the grocery stores 40% full, for example. All of the things that they are doing right now, particularly this weekend, people are going to be shopping for their Easter meals. They've got the plexiglass going at the checkout counter. They've got some of the employees are wearing individual shields. So they have done a lot of things that, and I think this is a good thing. They're visual confirmations of the fact that this store is on top of it. They are doing these things.
I agree.
Jayme?
I think, you've got to be honest. The best policy is to prevent it from happening, to have good safety policies and good uh, paid medical leave policies for your employees. But if and it can and does happen, and this disease can take a few days to manifest itself, you've got to immediately tell your customers. You've got to explain, here's what happened, here's what we're doing to discover why or how it happened, and here's what happens next. That's your responsibility. I think that is an ethical and professional thing if it happens. And then, of course, let your first call be, to the local hospital, to the local health authorities, get their input and their support in how you respond. But it would be unthinkable to have an employee who may have come in contact with your customers fall ill and not tell those customers immediately with some obviously some guidance. That would, I think, if it comes out, it would damage your reputation for a very, very long time.
I think that's a good point, John. We want to be the ones to put out the not so good news proactively. We don't want to be called out on it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So thank you for sharing that. I also have a question about communication in general. People, you've talked about social media. People are not in their offices, so phone is really not an option, especially for a small business that maybe has to go completely remote. They may not want to share their personal cell phone number with someone to say, like, call us if we have a question. Do you guys have recommendations of how can we think about communication differently right now? We obviously can't mail things either. How do we make this easy for people who don't have access to computers?
Right. Well, you can mail things actually, because the post office is open. I mailed something just the other day, and I think that this goes back to that elements of the crisis plan and being prepared by one of the things that we can all do is know who we might want to communicate with and how do we get in touch with them. And I've seen this evolve from, we've been working on crisis situations since back in the late 80s when you had to have the people's address and you had to have their home phone numbers, to now where you want to have their cell phone numbers so that you can send out a text message very quickly. And this does also go back to a point that I made earlier about doing that research in advance and knowing the best way to reach those stakeholder audiences. Sometimes it might be signage in a certain place, that that this particular audience is going to congregate. I think that really does need to be thought through, and as much as you can research that in advance. Again, to use another school's example, the alumni are usually the hardest to track down because they're constantly moving around, but schools are putting some time and energy into that, because when they want to put out something of an emergency nature, they want to have that cell phone or email address.
I would just add, set boundaries. A lot of us are stuck with just one phone, our cell phone. If you tell clients or customers when you're available or set times in advance to talk to them, Zoom is a great feature, but it can get a little shaky because so many people are using it and there have been some real issues. Learn these platforms, learn this technology, make it work for you. I think that's really important. Obviously, if you're having issues with your Wi-Fi or technological limitations, do what you can to address it. I mean, a cell phone is more powerful than a computer from 5 years ago. And so there are lots of workarounds out there. I think you'll find that people are very sympathetic, especially if you set boundaries in advance. If you tell somebody, call me anytime, and they call you at 10 o'clock and you get upset, well, that's on you. But we're all working from new environments. Those of us who have kids, are trying to help them. I'm sitting here with Shelby. She's been very helpful. But it's the situation that we're in, and I think if people aren't sympathetic to innovation and new thinking, then they've got some learning to do. But it's not our place to teach them. It's our place to work with the tools that we have in front of us and make it work until things get better.
I see we have one more really good question here that I'd love to squeeze in an answer to before we sign off. But another question from Lynn of how to best balance the privacy and legal rights of sick employees in public communications in the time of burn the witch sentiment.
Yes, well, and fortunately we have something called HIPAA, which prevents us from giving private information out about individuals in terms of what's going on with them from a health perspective. But that's why you'll see, an employee who works at Stop and Shop, for example, has been identified as having COVID-19. They're not going to go into the details as to who this person is or what hospital they're at, because that's completely not an appropriate thing. The HIPAA restricts us from doing that. And you're a legal person, whether you've got somebody, if you're a larger company that has an internal legal person, attorney on staff, or you're using outside counsel, they'll be weighing in on that as well, because we don't want to cross that line. You don't need to say their name.
No, there's absolutely no reason to say their name. And there's, listen, somebody falls ill, it's not their fault.
Right.
There have been so many people who have been so careful. There's a story in the Union Leader about this week, and worn gloves and worn face masks and still get this disease. We're all in the same boat. But no, you should never point out an employee by name, but you do want to let customers and folks know if there's somebody that they've come in contact with, that potential exists. And then obviously support that employee as much as you can, because he or she needs to get better and has a family to support. And again, I think the more we see ourselves as a village, as a society, and communicate that way, the better we're going to get through that. The more we see ourselves as individuals and everyone's in for themselves, that's when social lines break down and communication becomes very difficult, because we're just not listening anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to end on, Jayme, and it is an opportunity to collaborate, because we've all heard the catchphrase, we're all in this together, and it's the absolute truth. So how can we help each other?
And the Chamber is such a great resource. We are so glad that it is here. And it is the tough times like this that you see who your real friends and where you can go for support. So I know both Rob and I from our heart say thank you to the Chamber for being there and doing as much as they have done publicly and behind the scenes to help our community as it struggles.
Well, I just have to say, thank you again to you guys. Back at you. We've thankfully been able to partner with you and some other wonderful organizations to provide these webinars. So the way that people are coming together right now is very inspiring, especially in Concord, I think. Yeah. All right. So on that, please, take note of this last slide with contact info. If you have additional questions, I'll also be emailing people later with the full video of today's webinar, as well as, some additional resources that may be useful to you as well. So thank you so much, Jayme and Robin, for joining us today, and good luck with all of your communications moving forward, everyone. Thank you.
And same to you. Thank you, Emily. We enjoyed it. Thank you.